massive breaking news on the War Thunder front. In my endeavor to spade every vehicle, hit a massive breakthrough. I have spaded every rank 1 French tank. Now, to be honest, I did complain about this a lot early on because I was playing USSR tanks, which are pretty fast and pretty powerful, or Japanese tanks, which have a surprising amount of punch, or Swedish tanks, which have what I feel is a pretty good all around package. And then I climbed into these French monstrosities and moved at 10 kilometers per hour for what felt like days on end. And I thought these had to be the worst tanks in the game. I now got why people made so many jokes about French tanks. But then, along the way, something weird happened. I played a bit more of these French tanks, and by the end, I found myself having fun. And that's when I landed on the unexpected conclusion that these French tanks are actually surprisingly beginner friendly. So let's talk about the reasons real quick. I'll get them all out of the way up front, and then we'll explore them a bit more deeply. And honestly, some of these reasons serve double duty as to why they're good, but also why I didn't like them early. So I'll try to make sure I discuss both sides as I go through. So first and foremost, number one, good protection. 2, they're slow, which actually is good and bad. 3, the guns do suck, but they teach you need to aim. 4, they've just got really cool history. And then 5, I didn't even realize this until I was looking up some more information, but they actually have a very beginner-friendly mechanism that I never had any idea I was taking advantage of. Diving into the first and most important piece by far, the protection. It is the biggest factor as to why I'm willing to call these French tanks beginner-friendly. It's because they have this really, really good protection. I mean, if you look at them visually, they look like they have really thick steel armor. I mean, it looks like they just took massive chunks of steel and threw it on tracks, put a gun on, and said, good luck out there. And not just that, but the armor tends to have some odd curves that you just don't see in every other nation, which I don't know the mechanics of armor that well. I'm still looking into it and learning, but I do believe that not having flat armor makes shells a little more likely to glance off instead of to penetrate. And I've talked about this a lot in plenty of videos. Easily, in my experience, and I assume I'm roughly representative of a lot of goofy, no talent War Thunder players, but easily the biggest problem people like me have is rushing headstrong into danger, thinking the tank can deal with a lot more damage than it actually can, thinking it's a tank that's going to shrug off some shells and fight on through. Obviously, that's not the case. And a lot of times, these shells that are specifically designed to penetrate armor do in fact penetrate armor when you push too far too fast, but a lot of us do it anyway, and that's led to a lot of pointless deaths. France is the first nation at low rank that actually has, to me, a fairly reliable ability to shrug off some of those early shells. I mean, it is impossible to overstate the importance of being able to have a shot or two even glance off your armor, and that gives you at least some chance to react and return fire, rather than being one shot from a hidden position every single time, which, let me tell you, is something I experienced a lot in pretty much every single other nation, and honestly do still experience to this very day. So that's the first part of it. French tanks truly are, I would say, one of 2 in the entire game at rank 1 that can actually deal with a few hits, the other again being USSR. And like I said, when you're starting out, the ability to last even a little bit longer on the battlefield is probably the biggest difference maker to your experience and to your advancement in the game. So France having that ability is huge. The second piece is the speed of these tanks, and this both works against the player and then surprisingly, in a way you don't quite think about, helps the player, at least let's say in realistic ground battles. I'm sure it's a bit different in arcade battles when everybody gets to drive 60 kilometers per hour and careen around corners, but in realistic battles these tanks drive a realistic speed, and that speed is incredibly slow. Now, you might think this is a bad thing, and I actually complained about this a lot early on in French tanks. I was like, man, I can never get anywhere. I can never be part of the fights. I can't even capture any points because all I'm doing is driving around at 10, 15 kilometers per hour looking to get somewhere. I mean, if I saw a hill, that was pretty much the hardest enemy in the game at that point. But you know what? In realistic battles at low rank, you get a lot of research points for driving around and being alive. And as I mentioned before, new players, well, at least me, and I assume a handful of other new players, I did meet one guy in Discord who said he was good from day one and never had a problem. What a blessed soul. Couldn't have been me. But anyway, new players, and me specifically, have this tendency. I wanted to charge headfirst into battle, like I mentioned before. I think I'm going to tank some hits and be the swashbuckling hero, which of course gets you killed very fast, and then you don't really learn anything except for tanks are pretty fragile and War Thunder is really hard. So having these French tanks limited in speed, not by intention, or at least not on purpose for that reason, but having them limited all of a sudden means it's pretty much impossible for you to overextend because you're never going to get there. Now again, if you're a skilled player who is dying to be part of the action, yeah, it's going to be a little frustrating for you to try to get there. And if you're a new player who is dying to be part of the action, but unfortunately for the wrong reasons, it also might be frustrating, but it actually acts as a very helpful limiter, especially when you're someone like me who is sorely lacking in ability. Combined with the protection, you actually get to stay alive a bit longer. And I think when I was looking back at some of my matches, I was like, wow, I actually made it to the end routinely in these things because, well, I was never part of the fights to begin with. And if I was just shrugging off some pot shots from a distance. It wasn't that bad. Now, a part that was interesting to me, and it might just be me on this one, but I like to learn about why tanks are designed the way they are. I generally believe that tanks are always designed with a purpose, like each component was typically designed to address something that soldiers saw on the battlefield that their enemies had. So I was like, well, what is it? Why are these things built that way? And it actually addresses points 1 and 2 about the protection and the speed. So I thought initially that all these French tanks were designed to be a part of the Maginot line. And I apologize for my pronunciation if you're a native French speaker. I'm working on it. But I thought they were designed with this logic. Okay, we have one threat. That threat is Germany, and we know where they are, and we know where they're going to come from. So all we need is to build a really strong line, and we don't care if the tanks are particularly fast. What we do care about is that they can get there eventually and set up a really good defensive line that nobody could penetrate. And that assumption on my part was maybe 40% right. The actual truth behind the design was in response to how bad World War I was for France. They suffered so many losses, so the military doctrine prioritized protecting their soldiers and keeping as many people alive as possible. And that played out in two design features. One, they slapped a good bit of armor on these things. People aren't expendable. We can't let them get blown up as often. We got to keep our men safe. And the second is that the tanks were designed to operate at what they called foot pace, meaning the idea was the army was always going to move as one, the tanks wouldn't leave the soldiers behind and vice versa, so they designed them to just operate at foot speed because there was no need for them to go faster. They would never leave their soldiers behind. So the entire design of these French tanks early on was about operating as a unit and maximizing survivability, which kind of does play out in War Thunder. Pretty cool, right? So next is the guns, and this is something people complain about a good bit, and of course I'm part of that crowd. We all complained about the firepower of French tanks. Good survivability, slow to move around, which again, blessing and a curse, double-edged sword, but the guns just aren't that good. Well, maybe the guns are fine, but the ammo is not good. Nothing explosive for a long time, so solid shot. Now, in a tank that can take a few hits, that's actually somewhat okay because it does give the opportunity to learn about shot placement. Whereas my early times with American tanks and some British tanks were, again, solid shot, but also I was getting one shot by the enemy. So I never had a chance for a second opportunity. If I even saw a tank the first time, well, I'd get one shot. I'd get blown up. Maybe I would get one single shot off, but if that wasn't perfectly placed, guess what? They were going to respond with explosives. And there I went, out of the match because of my paper-thin armor. With these French tanks, you get the combination of solid shot, decent enough guns that can penetrate, and actually a little bit of chance to get off a second, and maybe even a third shot before the enemies get you. And that's huge. Now, of course, it's up to the individual user. Thankfully, I did this about 500 hours in versus 10 hours in, so I could put a little more thought into where the shot should go, which made me a tiny bit more effective. Not great, but even at my barely advanced stage, it actually makes a difference. And I'm just at level 39 right now. I actually learned a good bit through this process. And again, I had squad mates supporting me, but hey, that's French doctrine. And all this made me a better shooter in War Thunder. And then one more thing I didn't know until I was looking up some information on these tanks is in the real world, they actually have, well, some of the models have a version of a stabilizer. Some of these rank 1 tanks have a gun that could be like detached inside the tank and rest on the gunner's shoulder inside the tank itself. They could pull a lever, put it on their body to stabilize the guns because they weren't huge, and that let them be a little more stable and effective at very, very slow speeds. Now, obviously, the game's not going to model crews putting guns on their shoulder, but apparently they did add a very light stabilizing effect in the game at super low speeds, again, for some of the French tanks. I'm not sure if I took advantage of this or not, but who knows? Maybe that's why I was a bit more effective. To summarize all this, I thought France rank 1 tanks were going to be a much worse experience, but the more I played, the more I realized these were actually really fun tanks. Now, maybe it was the Discord squad that made it a lot more fun. If you do want to squad up, please join. We've got games going pretty much all the time, it seems like. But anyway, French tanks were powerful, effective, and not that bad to play. And that's why I believe France rank 1 tanks are secretly beginner-friendly in War Thunder. And that is all for today, my friends. Thank you so much for tuning in for this exploration of French tanks. I hear rank 2 is where it starts to get really fun. Can't wait. If you want to join along some of these hijinks, please do in the Discord. Links in the description and in my profile. Subscribe to the channel if you can. If not, we'll see you next time either way. This is Mediocre Thunder signing off.